When I took on being a colloquium chair, I really knew nothing about it. And I asked a fellow Plato member, Jim Adler, who knew a great deal about it, how he chose speakers. And he said that he chose speakers by thinking about the people that he would most like to sit down at a fabulous dinner with and listen to them talk and learn from them and their experiences. And Terry McCarthy falls in this category for me, although I personally would want to ply him with a couple of stiff drinks first, because I am sure that he has many, many interesting stories if you could get him to tell them. He is currently the president of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, which makes his life pretty interesting. But that's not why he's here today. He's here today to talk to us about his previous career, where he spent 27 years in the field reporting world's events and in the world's hotspots around the globe. What are the challenges of wartime journalism, and what is the changing reality of this profession in today's dangerous and polarized world? Based on his own experiences, these will be the topics that Terry's going to talk to us about today. But I know you're all eagerly looking forward to the Q&A session, and so I wanted to give you a partial list for people who may have forgotten or have not seen the original poster of some of the events that Terry's been involved in, so you can think about what kind of questions you might like to ask. He was the bureau chief for various news organizations, including Time, CBS, and ABC in Tokyo, Shanghai, and Los Angeles, as well as setting up the war zone bureaus and acting as chief in Baghdad and Kabul. He was one of the first reporters to enter North Korea on one of several trips he made there after Kim Il-sung's death. Immediately following 9/11, he traveled to Kabul to report on the U.S. military's efforts to oust the Taliban. He spent 4 months embedded with the Marines in Afghanistan, specifically with a team of bomb disposal experts, for which he won an Emmy and the Edward R. Murrow Award for his reporting. He filmed inside the eye of a Category 4 hurricane off the coast of Florida. He covered the anti-Mubarak revolution in Cairo, the trial and execution of Saddam Hussein, the death of Pol Pot, and the civil war in Cambodia. He has visited with Aung San Suu Kyi in her home and interviewed her about her plans for democracy in Burma. He's done extensive reporting on cyber attacks on U.S. corporations and was present in Iraq for both the invasion and the troop surge in 2007. He won another Emmy for his reporting on the war's impact on the Iraqi people 4 years after the invasion was over. He has been expelled from at least 3 countries that I know of: Burma, Cambodia, and Indonesia, which seems like a badge of courage to me or something. But at this point, I'm going to stop because the list goes on and on and on. But it gives you a starting point to think about what you might like to quiz him about. So I'm going to turn and introduce my friend Terry McCarthy and ask you to welcome him very warmly. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Plato Society. It's a great honor to be introduced here and to be talking to you. I'm going to just put my clock on here so I see I don't go on too long, and I'm going to take this out so I can walk around a little bit. I see a lot of Bernie Sanders badges in the audience. So I think I'm probably safe in saying that if I were being a war correspondent today, I'd probably be heading for Ted Cruz and Sarah Palin and Donald Trump, which seems to be probably the most dangerous place to be reporting from right now. But my experience predated this refinement of American democracy. And I dealt with less salubrious parts of the world. I wonder how many of you, actually, just before I start, how many have read Tolstoy's War and Peace? Yeah, quite a lot. So this is a 1,300-page novel. And when you reach the end of that 1,300 pages, there's a postscript, because Tolstoy, of course, always had more stuff to add. And at the very end of that, you might recall, some of you, he asked himself the question, what was it that caused millions of people to begin killing each other in this extraordinary series of wars in Napoleonic Europe? And then, of course, he goes on for another few pages. Nothing Tulsa ever did was brief. And finally comes to the conclusion, you know what? I don't know. I often thought, gee, Leo, you know, after 1,300 pages, you still can't tell me why? But it's something that's been with me for a lot of my career. We humans seem predisposed to fight each other. There's a story in the New York Times today you might have seen. They've just discovered the remnants of some humans who apparently were killed in some kind of a war 10,000 years ago in Kenya. So it seems like it's, and the relevance of that is, as the archaeologists explained, this is before we were even an agricultural society. So one of the theories that war started when we had to steal, you know, the agricultural benefits of some other group of people, even that doesn't apply. When we were hunter-gatherers, we were already killing each other. So it runs deep into our psyche, and there's clearly a deep fascination that we as humans have with warfare and with killing other people. And it's twinned with a repulsion, because it is the most obscene thing that we can do, to kill another human being. But it's almost like we can't take our eyes away from it. And today I'm going to explain to you, insofar as I can from my perspective, why I was a war correspondent for so long, what attracted me to it, why I still today watch ISIS videos. And there's a reason for that. It's not because I like war porn, but I think that some people have to do that. I'm going to try and get to that. And also talk to you a little bit about why I think it's important that we have foreign correspondents who will do wars. Because it's not an easy thing to do. I'm married, I have 4 kids. I gave up 4 years ago doing this. It has some downsides. A number of my colleagues have paid for it with their lives, others with their health. But I think it's a very important function within the bigger world of media, and I'm going to try and get to that in what I talked to you about today. The first foreign correspondent, I think one can argue, was Thucydides, back in the 4th century BC, a Greek author, historian, who wrote his great work on the Peloponnesian War. And Thucydides famously said, very few people take the trouble to go out and find out what's really going on. Most people will just repeat the first story they're told and go with that. And so he actually took the trouble to go out and talk to the Athenians and the Spartans who were involved in the war, and composed that long work about the war. I'm going to sort of take him as a touchstone for what I'm saying, because to me, the definition of a war correspondent is somebody who takes the trouble and runs some risk to try and find out what's really going on. And wars are famously hard. The fog of war, you've heard that expression. Wars are famously hard to understand as they progress, because so many things happen at the same time so quickly. Lots of people are scared. Instinctively, if a big bang happens, everyone ducks, which means you don't see what happens until afterwards. So, you know, there's a lot of mystery surrounding wars and warfare, and multiple lawsuits after wars, who did what, when, and, you know, who was killing whom. It's always very confusing. So I think it's important to try and understand what's happening in a war. I was working for Time magazine in 2003 when it became clear that the US was going to invade Iraq. And I, along with a bunch of other journalists, several thousand, was sent to the Middle East. I was in Kuwait in January, February of that year, as we built up this enormous force in the northern Kuwaiti desert. And I was not an embedded reporter. There were about, in fact, according to the US military, there are 755 reporters who were embedded with the invasion force coming up from Kuwait into Iraq. I was not one of those embedded reporters. I chose with a few of my colleagues to be, as we call ourselves, the unilaterals. So we rented some 4-wheel drives from some gullible rental agency in Kuwait, told them we were looking for surfing beaches down south. We'll be back in a month. And off we went with, you know, water strapped to the roof. So Time magazine in those days closed the magazine Friday night, Saturday morning. And I remember we crossed the berm between Iraq and between Kuwait and Iraq. I think it was Thursday. And we got back late Friday night. We got as far as Basra. And drove back, because we didn't have a way of filing from Basra, so we drove back into Kuwait. And when we got back to phone and computer connections, the first draft of Time magazine's cover story of that week had already been written. because the embedded correspondents who were with the Marines and the Army, they were using the military's satellite communications to send the stories back. And I read through the first draft, and typically a cover story in Time magazine in those days on something as complex as a war would have 7 or 8 different correspondents filing, and then somebody in New York would put it all together. And I read through the story, and it was pretty good. It was interesting. You know, the Marines were on their bull run up in the desert, and lots of action. But as I read through it, I realized that there wasn't a single quote from an Iraqi in the entire story. And I had, because I was traveling by myself, we'd been able to stop and talk to some Iraqis in a border town called Safwan, and also in some outlying neighborhoods of Basra. We didn't get into Basra because that was still being fought for, but we had some Iraqis. And most of what they were saying to us, and these are Shiites in the south of Iraq, most of what they were saying to us was, we hope the US doesn't make the same mistake as it made back in 1991. You've got to go all the way to Baghdad, take out Saddam, or he will come back after us again. And so they had great anxiety that Saddam was still not finished. This time we got rid of Saddam, for better or worse. But the fear at the time amongst the Iraqis was the US was not going to do the job properly. So I filed to New York and I said, you know what, we really need to put in some Iraqi quotes. The reason, of course, they didn't have any Iraqi quotes was that all those correspondents who were embedded with the US military were traveling in convoys with Bradleys and tanks with 50 caliber machine guns and so on. And if you were an Iraqi and you saw this coming at you, the last thing you were going to do was to say, oh, interview me please, or, you know, can I talk right now? They would run the opposite direction. And that became a sort of a fatal flaw of the reporting in Iraq, which was, as it became more dangerous, and I'm not saying it was a journalist's fault, but as it became more dangerous from 2004, 2005 on, as the insurgency started to take off, journalists were almost obliged to travel with the US military. It was very hard to travel on your own. And that precluded talking to Iraqis because they were scared. And there were so many stories of nervous American troops firing at vehicles coming towards a convoy, even if they really had no hostile intent. The Iraqis learned that it was dangerous to be close to American military, and because the journalists were embedded with the military, they couldn't get to the Iraqis. And I think that led to this blindness that we suffered from for some years. We didn't understand what was going on in Iraq. The Pentagon certainly didn't really understand the insurgency. Our administration at the time, Cheney, Rumsfeld, had no clue what was going on. And we found ourselves finally in this horrendous, effectively a civil war in Iraq, which cost 4,000 American lives, tens of thousands of Iraqi lives, $1 trillion US, and we're still not out of it. I think the real problem we had with Iraq was we didn't understand what we were getting into. We had no clue. The difference between Sunni and Shia was almost unknown in the White House. The State Department had some experts, but they weren't being listened to. And the reporting coming from the field wasn't helping either because the journalists didn't have a lot of access. And so we got ourselves into a war that we didn't understand, and the costs, I don't have to underline, were horrendous. That to me is an object lesson in how important it is to be able to understand what is going on the ground, that Thucydides' motto. When I started in the mid-'80s, I was telling the story over lunch, I was reporting in Central America, which was, in those days, was the big story. In 1985, I was there. The Contras and the Sandinistas were having at it in Nicaragua, and El Salvador was a civil war. We were on the side of the right-wing government, and then the FMLN guerrillas were up in the mountains, supported by Cuba and the Soviets. But in those days, journalists had almost total access. We could walk around. We used to have these T-shirts which said, "No me tires, yo soy periodista, don't shoot me, I'm a journalist." But it was a joke. You know, it was funny, because no one, of course, why would you shoot a journalist? And you could literally take a cab from San Salvador in the morning, drive up into the foothills of the mountains, talk to the guerrillas, then drive back in the afternoon, talk to the army, and no one would do anything to you because you were a journalist. That's gone now. That's, you know, you try and do that, drive out of Kabul and try and talk to the Taliban, and you won't come back, and they will separate your head from your body, definitively. The loss, I think, to journalism is enormous there, and we saw that, a prefiguring of that, a foreshadowing of that in Iraq. It became worse in Afghanistan, and now in Syria it's almost absolute. And we've seen these horrendous cases of journalists who've tried to report from Syria, Jim Foley and Steve Sotloff being two that come to mind, who literally were beheaded. And so we have no clue what's going on there, really. We don't understand what's going on. That to me is a tremendous loss to our understanding of the situation, and makes it very hard for us to come up with solutions. Quite clearly, we need to find a solution to the war in Syria, not only for humanitarian reasons, but also a continued war in Syria will effectively destroy the European Union, because they cannot take all these refugees. They've got 1 million so far this year. There's another 10, 12 million to come, and Europe just can't sustain that. And so I think there are multiple reasons why we have to solve the war in Syria. We will not do that unless we understand what the different players have at stake there. We need to understand Assad. We need to understand what the Russians want, what the Iranians want, what the Saudis want. Everyone has their own agenda there. We need to understand that. And also what the Syrians want. And by the Syrians, that includes the Sunnis, includes the Shiites, the Christians, and so on and so forth, the Kurdish. So it's a complicated situation, very hard to understand, and very hard for correspondents to get access to. The second, I think, important role that foreign correspondents, war correspondents play, is going to areas that do not permit domestic reporting. So in other words, where Western correspondents serve as proxies for their own for the countries they're based in. I'm going to give an example from Burma. And Terry mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi in her kind introduction. In 1988, I was one of just 4 journalists who was able to get into Rangoon when the Burmese military staged a coup and started shooting the students. It was very hard to find a way in. The Burmese embassies were no longer issuing any visas. I was based in Bangkok at the time, and we effectively we cheated. We went to Chinatown in Bangkok, and we had a guy make a fake stamp in the image of the Burmese visa and stamp it into our passports, and then put a fake number and a fake signature. And with that, we presented ourselves at the airports, and we're lucky enough to get through. It was just 4 of us: Melinda Liu from Newsweek with her photographer Steve Lehman, Lynn Newman from the San Francisco Chronicle, and myself. And we arrived just as the army had taken power. The military, very brutal in Burma, have had control of that country ever since. But they were facing an a group of students who were protesting the dictator Ne Win and calling for, as they called it, democracy, democracy. It was quite charming, democracy. They were all crazy for democracy. And they were looking for a spokesperson, a leader, because they were just a bunch of students, kind of like Tiananmen Square the following year in China. They didn't have a leader. And in Burma, they found the leader, Aung San Suu Kyi. So her dad, Aung San, was the effective George Washington of Burma. He negotiated independence for the Burmese from the UK. He's a national hero in Burma. And so she happened to be visiting. She was married to an Englishman living in Oxford. She happened to be visiting because her mom was sick in Rangoon. And so the students would come by her house and say, Dosu, we need you to come and speak to us. And she was resisting, but finally she went out. She gave the first speech in front of the Shwedagon Pagoda in Rangoon, was mobbed by hundreds of thousands of students, and then she effectively found herself as the leader of the opposition. So when the army started shooting on day 3 after we got in, she was there stuck in her house, hugely frustrated that the army had given up on dialogue and were just trying to mow down these students, which they did, and the students were defenseless. They had no weapons. She gave a number of interviews to me and to my colleagues in that house in University Avenue, where she still lives, by the lake. And we were able to get the story out. It's funny, but we were all in the Strand Hotel, which was the only real hotel in Rangoon at the time. And there was an old telex machine with the tape and the little holes in it, if you recall that. And there was I didn't know how to use it, but there was a lady who worked at the hotel who could do it. And so we paid her to basically stay there for the entire 2 weeks we were there. And she just did the telex, which was the only way we could get out to London and to the US. And I did a long profile on Aung San Suu Kyi, as did my colleagues. As you know, later, Aung San Suu Kyi was sentenced to house imprisonment. She spent 12 years in her house as a prisoner. My view is that in those types of situations, the foreign press has an enormous role in terms of protecting people and informing their own people what's going on inside their own country. Because the Burmese had no journalists active then. They all listened to BBC News and Voice of America, which were basically reusing our stories because they had no other source of information. And without wanting to take any credit for this, I do think that had there not been any publicity about Aung San Suu Kyi by those 4 foreign journalists, of whom I was one, in Rangoon at the time, the military might well have gone ahead and killed her. There would have been no Nobel Peace Prize and none of what we know to be Aung San Suu Kyi. And I want to be careful here not say, you know, I'm the savior of Aung San Suu Kyi. It's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that there are countries in this world, and China is another one, where they do not have the ability, the domestic press does not have the ability to report on things that can be matters of life and death. And I think in that case, in these cases, the foreign media performs an enormous service because in the end of the day, we were always free to go. I didn't ever think that the Burmese military was going to kill me, and we could have got stuck in the crossfire in this, when they were shooting students, but they weren't going to come and literally assassinate us. Graham Greene says in The Quiet American, he has that great phrase about the courage of somebody with a return ticket in their back pocket. You know, generally, foreign correspondents, you're going to get out alive. ISIS accepted. Generally, governments don't kill foreign journalists. But I think for domestic journalists, often they won't get out alive. Well, they go to jail for 30 years, and so we have a privileged role to play there. The final story I want to talk about is from Afghanistan. I spent quite a lot of time with the US Marine Corps in the south of Afghanistan. The Marines almost always get sent to the worst part of any war that we're involved in, and that's what they train for. And Helmand province in the southern part of Afghanistan was the toughest province of all for US forces. It's where we lost most men. It's right on the border with Pakistan. It was a major smuggling route for heroin for opium on the way out, and for IEDs, these bombs that they put underground, improvised explosive devices on the way in. So it came across the desert. The explosives would be brought in, broken down into their constituent parts, which is basically ammonium nitrate fertilizer, and then they add some oil, and they put in these wires and batteries, quite simple, and they can be devastating. And so the Marines were sent to Helmand to try and stop this and to push the Taliban back from these opium-producing fields that have produced so much money for the Taliban over the last decade or so. In 2010, President Obama announced his mini surge into Afghanistan, and I was at CBS News at the time. We were discussing how we would actually cover this. And, you know, we'd seen the surge in Iraq, and it had worked pretty well. Petraeus, I think, had done a pretty good job bringing violence down in Iraq from 2007 to 2009. Bush left in 2008, Obama took over, and he decided he was going to get out of Iraq, which my personal view was a mistake, and invest more heavily in Afghanistan. And so we were talking in the network, how do you cover this? Afghanistan is not an easy country to get around. You really couldn't go anywhere outside of Kabul without US military support, to my point about the embedded nature of covering the war. And it was unclear what would be your metric? How would you know if this surge is working or not? You can take the military's figures, but the military will always inflate their achievements, as they do. So what would be an independent way of measuring this? So instead of trying to spread ourselves too thinly across the entire country, we decided we'd pick one area of one province and follow it for the duration. And so I had some contacts with the Marines from Iraq, and I went back to them and I said, here's what I want, a battalion that's going there that I can follow all the way through. And so I ended up being put in touch with 3rd Battalion 1st Marines. We were out of Camp Pendleton, which was convenient for us because I could get to know them just driving down from LA. So we filmed them as they trained here before they left. We flew over with them, and then we spent a total of 4 months on the ground out of their 7-month deployment. We went in and out 3 times, and then we followed them back. And the idea was that we'd be able to get to know their area of operations and see whether they were improving life there or whether things were getting worse. And sure enough, Marines are pretty tough, and when they're given a mission, they'll execute the mission. And within 7 months, areas where we first went, where we were being shot at when we stepped outside the base, were becoming more pacified, and then they would put up schools, and the kids could go to school, and they would push the Taliban a bit further, and then they would repeat the exercise. So they were clearly spreading a certain degree of stability, at least temporarily, and I will stress temporarily. In August, they had one final objective to achieve in this particular deployment of this battalion. It was a town called Safar Bazaar, Bazaar as in marketplace. And Safar Bazaar is right down the south of Helmand, and it was the town that the Taliban used to put together the different components of the IEDs that they were smuggling in. So they were smart enough not to bring in pre-assembled bombs, because the Marines had these long-range reconnaissance teams that were ranging across the desert, and if they stopped you and you had a bomb on your motorcycle, then you go to jail. But if they stopped you and you had a tub of ammonium nitrate, they couldn't do anything, because you could say it's fertilizer, which it is. Or if they stopped you and they found long coils of copper wire, you could say, well, I'm an electrician. Or the batteries, you know what, I sell them in the market. So they were smart enough to bring them in components that they could get away with, and then they were putting them together in this town in Safar Bazaar, and then they would bring them further up and put them in the ground and blow up people. And not just Americans, by the way, a lot of Afghans are killed by these IEDs too, in fact, probably more Afghans than American troops. So the Marines planned for some months, they were planning how they were going to take back this town. It was going to be the last objective in their deployment, and it would clear the Taliban out of this entire area of Garmsir, which is a big area in southern Helmand. The Taliban, of course, were not stupid. They knew the Marines were coming, and so they sowed the entire perimeter of this town with IEDs. They had no shortage of them. And so the attack, if you like, on the town was not some Hollywood cavalry-led charge across the desert with flags waving into the town. It was a very slow, methodical advance, yard by yard, as they scanned every square foot with their metal detectors for these bombs. And they were pulling out an enormous number of these IEDs. So we followed a team of 2 EOD techs, explosive ordnance disposal techs. One of them is called Johnny Jones. He's a sergeant from Atlanta, Georgia. And he was pulling these things out of the ground. It was like Hurt Locker. It was extraordinary. Some of them he was able to disarm and pull out. Some of them, if they were too well embedded or he wasn't sure about it, he would blow them in place, put a bit of extra explosive there and just blow them up. Excuse me. So we followed him for 6 days, and on day 7, Johnny had a momentary lapse of concentration. He was looking at a wooden hut, and there was a tube pointing out the back window of this hut on the outskirts of the town, and they were unclear as to whether this was a mortar tube or just a pipe. And he walked over, and he had an engineer beside him, and he stopped to talk to the engineer, and he lifted up the metal detector, and he turned around and he put his foot out like that. And don't you know what happened? Of course, that was where the ID was. So it blew up. It blew Johnny up into the air. It blew his legs off. The force of the explosion took both his legs off, flipped him up, and he came back down on his back. The engineer standing beside him. So explosions go up in a cone when they're buried, and so because the engineer was one remove aside, the explosion got him in the head, and it took the top of his skull off, so he died. So Johnny is down there on the ground. The Marines bring out some stretchers and carry him and the Greer, who was the engineer, back to the base. And while they're calling in the medevac helicopter, the commander goes in, and this is quite extraordinary. Actually, the commander goes in as a colonel, and he takes him by the hand, and Johnny's eyes were fused shut because he had some shrapnel in the face from the blast too, but he knew his legs were gone. And the colonel said, "How are you doing, son?" And this 28-year-old Marine, he says, "I'm sorry I screwed up, sir," which just tears me up even when I think about it today. Anyway, we had all this on film. My cameraman Randall Joyce and I were right there. We got to know these Marines pretty well. They trusted us with the usage of such material. We had several other incidents of Marines being killed on camera. And we took all this material back to New York. And then the most extraordinary thing happened, which was that the executive producer of CBS Evening News didn't want to show it. And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, this is it's too graphic. I don't think the viewers would like this." And so I knew what was going on. Yes, of course it was graphic, people being killed on camera graphic, but what he was really saying was our advertisers will not want to put advertising next to a story like this. So we had a big fight, and my argument was, you know, whatever you think about the war in Afghanistan or Iraq or anywhere else, the fundamental reality of a war is that people will get hurt and will get killed. And when the commander-in-chief makes the decision to send our troops to war and goes to Congress or not, and there's a discussion about this, we need to keep that in mind. I'm not a pacifist. There are some wars that certainly need to be fought, and I don't think anyone would suggest we shouldn't have fought Hitler. But before you start pulling that trigger, and we hear a lot of this today in Congress about boots on the ground, and Sarah Palin talking about kicking ass. I mean, I don't think she has any idea what she's talking about. Kicking ISIS's ass. I mean, that doesn't. But you need to understand, boots on the ground means some of those boots will not come home. People will be killed, will be maimed, lose their arms, their legs, a traumatic brain injury. War is extremely ugly. And so the argument that we put to the producers in New York, and particularly the executive producer, was we need to show the costs of war, because before we start making a decision to go to war again, you need to understand, are you prepared to pay this price? We're going to have tens of thousands of wounded veterans with us for the next 50 years. We're going to have to pay that price, and then lots of families who won't have a father or a brother or a husband back. We won that argument, and CBS News ran the footage, and that was one of the Emmys that we won, I think because it was so rare to see on US television or in the magazines or the newspapers. If you remember, under the Bush administration, they wouldn't even allow journalists to show pictures of the coffins coming back. And these are wooden boxes with the American flag on the top. You can't make any argument that this is too graphic. It's completely abstract in some sense. But that was an important victory for me, because having spent quite a lot of time covering conflicts, I think it's really important that we do open our eyes to the costs of conflict. I think it's way too easy for all these congressmen and women, most of whom haven't served in the military, to say we're not tough enough on whoever it is. We need to go out and put boots on the ground. Well, maybe in certain cases we do, but you need to have the idea of what that will potentially cost if you do that. And I think that it's very hard to challenge that narrative of America needs to go and kick ass, in that woman's terms, unless you've actually got the authority of a Thucydides who's been there and checked it out on the ground. And I think that's overall one of the most important contributions that war correspondents can make, which is to report the truth as they see it from the ground, not from the US military's perspective, nor from the censor's perspective, nor from whatever other second or third-hand sources, and there are many of them out there. But this is what I've seen, this is what I know to be true, and I want to tell you so that you can have a better conversation with your congressman or whatever when we talk about our next war. So that's, to me, is three, I think, pretty compelling reasons why we really need war correspondents. It's getting harder now. Media organizations have declining budgets. They can't afford, a lot of them, to send people overseas. There's immense pressure to take footage from third parties. A lot of the footage we're seeing from Syria and from Libya, not even shot by journalists, shot by people in their apartments with their iPhones out the window, risking getting their hand shot off, but who knows where that footage comes from. A lot of it's probably real, some of it may not be, we don't really know. But it's without on-the-ground testimony to what's going on, things get forgotten, ignored, or not reacted to. And I would point out, just in closing, that three of the most horrendous atrocities of the 20th century happened with no press coverage. The concentration camps in Germany were not reported on until afterwards. Mao's Great Leap Forward cost 30 million plus lives, no press coverage. The gulags, Stalin's gulags, no press coverage. Indeed, even Pol Pot, the killing fields of Cambodia, 1.7 million people, but out of a population of 8 million, almost a quarter of the population killed, no press coverage. Dictators, bad people, operate in the dark. They like the dark, they don't like being watched. It's why they have the torture chambers in the basements. It's out of sight, out of mind, and they can get away with horrible things. And I think it's the fundamental duty of a war correspondent to expose such horrible places to the light. And that's why I think I did what I did for 27 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Now, Rosemary and Dick will take questions from people that you would like to ask. If you just take turns and ask questions. Rosemary, you want to start? Anybody over here have a question?
Stand up, please.
My question is about Burma and Aung San Suu Kyi. I've read a lot about her and have some respect and so on. Please explain the Rohingya situation and why she will not take action or speak out or whatever she needs to do to save those Muslim people in the south of Burma.
That's a good question, and she has a bit of answering to do there. So the Rohingyas, for those of you who don't know, are a minority in Burma. A lot of them have come across from Bangladesh, but they're Muslim. The Burmese are a majority Buddhist country. And there has been a number of attacks by Buddhists against the Rohingyas in the past couple of years. Aung San Suu Kyi has been notable in her reticence to speak out against these attacks. I don't want to act as a shill for her, but I can try and, at least from what I know from having spent some time with her, explain why she's been slow to do this. She's playing a very delicate game. She understands that the future of Burma will depend on some kind of a modus operandi between the military and her NLD, basically civilian party. Her father was one of the founders of the Burmese military. She understands that very well. Back in 1988, when this thing first kicked off, she kept saying how important it was to keep talking to the military. If we demonize them, we won't get anywhere. And I think that what we're seeing today is an extension of that. It should be remembered that she is not as worldly as we might think because of her extended house detention. when the only source of information for her was the radio. She would listen to BBC. That was the only source of news she had. And BBC is not bad, but it's a very narrow little window onto the outside world. So although she came from a very educated background, she was married to an Oxford professor, she speaks wonderful English as well as, of course, Burmese. I think that for a long time she was bottled up in this little house, and her only way out was through the military. She needed to somehow cut a deal with the military. And it wasn't that she wanted to get out personally. She could have left Burma at any time. They would have happily put her on a plane and said, bye-bye, don't ever come back. For her, it was, how do I advance my democratic ambitions for Burma, and I need to do that with the military. Now, the military would be very against the Rohingyas. They see them as a threat, just as they see the Karen and the Kachin and all the other minorities that sort of populate the borders of Burma, and they're also non-Buddhist. The Karen and the Kachin are Christian, and Rohingyas happen to be Muslim. So I think what's happening there is she's basically trying to keep the military on side, and has not been as outspoken about the Rohingyas as perhaps a lot of other people would wish. Thank you.
Information from Syria comes out in a sort of very spotty manner. And there's one guy in England, I think his organization is called the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights. And some people say that it's just one person, he's making this stuff. Others say he has a great network out there where he's bringing in a lot of material and aggregating it. What's your thought on that, and how can they further develop getting information out of Syria?
Yes, that Syrian observatory, I think he probably is a real guy, and I think he does make efforts to get information as best he can. But of course, it's an imperfect art. He's reliant on cell phone connections that don't always last, scraps of information that it's very hard for him to confirm. You know, the real challenge we're facing with Syria is that this country is torn between a dictator who's fighting, as he sees an existential battle, for himself and his Alawite Shiite minority, and a Sunni majority who want to depose him and want payback for all the iniquities that were visited on them by his father, Hafez, culminating, as you probably know, in the great massacre in Hama in 1982, when Assad literally leveled the town of Hama and killed 100,000 people, Muslim brothers, Sunnis. So you've got a society which is absolutely fractured, and each of those parts, not to mention the Kurds and ISIS and so on, they have their own message that they want to get out. So the real challenge is not so much the information, it's who do you believe? Because obviously when you look at it from the perspective of Damascus and Assad, it looks very different to looking at it from the perspective of the Syrian opposition. Again, the perspective of the Kurds, and I don't even want to think what ISIS's perspective is. But you know, it's such a fractured country now that information has become part of the war, and we're seeing that as they try and decide on even who talks to the opposition at the peace talks. And the Saudis are trying to promote their group, and the US is saying, well, you know, we need some other groups involved. Who do you listen to? It's like when you smash a mirror and you look at your face in the mirror. Well, which is the image that you go with? Is that one there or this one there? You know, there is no single narrative anymore. It's been fragmented, and I think a peace process will face the enormous difficulty of putting the story together again before you can put the country together again, and that to me is a huge challenge.
Hello? Oh, somebody behind me.
Okay.
Oh, stand up.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
You have a lot of experience in looking at wars close range, and the clever people in the United States say we have to be careful which wars we get involved in. Okay. Let us say that the country, with a certain president in power, decides to get involved in a war against ISIS, as an example. Should we do it gradually? Send a few troops, probe it out, is it enough, not enough, we send some more? Or is it better to approach it full blast, with overwhelming force?
Well, I would hesitate to give a concrete recipe for every war that the United States should fight. I think if Japan blows up half of our fleet in Pearl Harbor, then we need to go full blast. I think in the Middle East it often it behoves us to be a bit more cautious. With ISIS, I think the way to confront ISIS is, firstly, you need to understand what ISIS is. ISIS is not a Syrian phenomenon, it's an Iraqi phenomenon. ISIS is run by the former generals and Muhabbarat of Saddam Hussein, Sunnis, who are trying to find a way to re-establish their power base in Iraq, which was taken away from them first by us when we got rid of Saddam and installed a Shiite government in Baghdad, and then in more extreme fashion by Maliki, who, once we left in 2011, pretty much kicked out every Sunni from any position of power that he could, and treated the Sunnis like pariahs. And so ISIS is a reaction to that. The only way really to overcome that is to re-empower the Sunnis in Iraq. And unfortunately, because we withdrew, we didn't really have much leverage over the Iraqi government, and re-establishing that leverage will take us some time. I think that the wacko fringe, the killers, the beheaders, you just have to kill them. There's no way of talking to people like that. I mentioned that I've seen some of these videos. They're truly horrendous, and they're young people. The guys that are in charge of this part of the atrocious campaign of horror and terror that ISIS puts on. These are kids who are playing a reality video game. That's how I think they see it. This is a fun thing to do. You're not playing a video game. You're actually killing people for real. Sorry about that. I think, but the guys that are running it behind the scenes, these are political operatives. They're not killing people for the sake of killing people. Nor are they that interested in the Islamic Caliphate, by the way. Saddam was pretty secular. They're using this as a way to recruit foot soldiers who will come and die for the Caliphate and get their 72 virgins. But this is not an Islamic movement. This is a power grab by some Sunnis who are desperate to find a way to reestablish themselves in Iraq. So I think you need to confront it politically, and absolutely you need to kill some of them. I don't think it should be American boots on the ground, because that's what they want. That basically justifies their narrative that the United States is against all Muslims. For the same reason, I think the most idiotic thing that Trump has ever said is, let's keep all Muslims out of the United States, because that justifies their narrative. Look, the United States hates Muslims. That's stupid. You need to somehow, you've got to kill the bad guys, but most of the people that are in the sphere of influence of ISIS, they don't really like it there. Iraqis are pretty secular people. They don't like being told that they can't listen to music or go to movies or smoke or wear nice clothes. So once you give the Sunnis an alternate model in Iraq, then I think ISIS's power over their foot soldiers diminishes, and then you can start moving towards a more peaceful solution. That's my view on ISIS. Sir.
Yes, thank you for an excellent presentation. You mentioned that in Iraq, one of the problems was that they didn't understand, the Pentagon didn't understand what was going on. And you made some reference to Syria as well. I think as far as wartime is concerned, it seems like Abraham Lincoln really understood what was going on in the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt really understood what was going on in World War II. Being president's like anything else. Some people are better than others. We may not have people in office recently that are up to that caliber. I'm wondering what you think about that. Or, on the other hand, there are always wars. My grandfather fought in World War I, my father fought in World War II, my friends fought in Vietnam, and my daughter's friends are fighting in Iraq. So, I'm just wondering whether you think some of this has to do with having outstanding leadership, or, as you pointed out, and I think your first sentence today, that war, people like to fight each other.
I don't know if you've seen that movie, Patton. But there's a great scene in that movie where Patton has outsmarted Rommel because he's double-guessed what he's going to do. And I think it's George Scott who's playing Patton. And there's this great scene where he says, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard, I read your book." And it's a great scene, because they did. Those warriors do. And the Iraqis were standing around saying, okay, so why are you allowing this looting? And they had no orders. And so they didn't do anything. Well, that was the first strike against the US forces. I was there. You know, the Iraq Museum, the National Museum of Iraq, which has got this extraordinary treasury of Sumerian, Mesopotamian art, was left for looters to break in and take stuff. Now, fortunately, the museum staff were smarter than the US government, and they knew what was coming. And so they took out most of the valuable stuff in advance of the fall of Baghdad. So they didn't lose any of the really valuable stuff. But a bunch of stuff was stolen. But we did nothing. All it would have taken was, you know, it shot 2 or 3 looters and told on the Iraqi radio that the American military was shooting looters. It would have stopped, just like that, because that's a language the Iraqis would have understood. If you do something, you get shot, so they stopped. But we did nothing, so it went on. And then we compounded that by dismissing the Iraqi army, and basically, and Bremer, who our pro-consul in Iraq, who equated the Ba'ath Party to the Nazis and said, right, we're going to denazify Iraq. Insane. That he created the insurgency right there. So we actually, not only do we not understand what we're doing, we actually created our own downfall. I think the bigger lesson there, and something that I've been trying all my life to do, is we need to understand the outside world. The United States tends to be a little bit too inward-looking, and when you think about the footprint of the United States in the world, we can do enormous good around the world. I originally come from Ireland. The Irish people will be eternally grateful for Bill Clinton and George Mitchell, who solved the Northern Ireland peace problem, Northern Ireland, the troubles as we call it, with the peace process there that eventuated in the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. That was 2 years of very patient diplomacy by George Mitchell, but in a part of the world that was familiar to the United States. They understood the United Kingdom, they understood the Irish, they had very good contacts, they were respected, and after 2 years we got the peace deal. And the same certainly did not apply in Iraq. They didn't understand the region, and you know, when the US goes in, its footprint is so big, the collateral damage will be enormous. So I have to say, I agree with you, there was a lamentable lack of understanding in the preparation to Iraq. Yes, you have the microphone? Sir.
Yes, sir. Again, thank you. We are obviously appreciative of your both philosophical view of journalism. I like your impression of the sophistication and use of journalism by ISIS.
So, firstly, the journalist in me recoils. You'll understand that at journalism of ISIS, it's propaganda. Yeah. But it's clever propaganda. Both at a technical level, you know, they do these things. There was a drowning video where they took some poor Iraqis in Mosul and they locked them in a cage, and then they lowered the cage by a crane into a swimming pool. But they had underwater cameras, which were waterproof cameras, taped to the outside of the cage, filming these people as they drowned. It was quite extraordinary. I mean, you know, David Cameron would you know, do the same thing for a movie if he were, you know, doing the Titanic. I mean, highly sophisticated. So they understand the technical side of it. But even more insidiously, they understand the shock value of this violence. And I go back to this video game. They are appealing to a generation of kids, and most of the killers are kids, I believe, or teenagers, young 20-year-olds, who grow up with this, you know, blasting things with fingers and thumbs going, and it's just an extension of that. And wow, wouldn't that be fun? You can go into it for real. It's very potent recruitment material, because that's what it is. People love it. They say, oh, I want to be part of that. You know, I can go and kill people and I'll be the hero. We haven't come up with good counter messaging. The State Department is trying. You know, they'll send out tweets and so on and so forth. It's a hard thing to counter because it goes for something guttural, this gut appeal that people have for violence. Wow, that's fun. I mean, it's like watching the big hits in the NFL, you know, same thing. Wow, you can hit him again. I'm not sure how you counter it. I think a lot more work should be coming from the Middle East, because when it's seen as an American counter message, that almost taints it from the get-go. I do think that in general, the Muslim world has been slow to voice its opposition, not just to ISIS, but to Al-Qaeda and to terrorism in general. I think that we need more voices from the Middle East. And you can see it, you know, cropping up in various places, but it is not as concerted as it needs to be. I think that we can try, but it's very hard for an American, particularly American government agency, to come out and say, well, this is wrong because we believe in democracy. Well, then it's very easy for ISIS to say, well, we told you so, they hate us. But they are very effective, and it's short of shutting down the internet, which I don't think is practical. I don't see how you shut them off. Well, Al Jazeera, they do some very good work. I know some Al Jazeera journalists. They're quite plucky. I was in Tahrir Square in Cairo in 2011, and most of the really good footage was shot by Al Jazeera until the Egyptians kicked them out. They get to places where other networks can't go. Clearly, they have a message they want to get across, which during the Iraq War was pretty anti-American. I don't think there's any argument about that. But I think Al Jazeera is still a journalistic operation with a slant. I think you could say the same about Fox News or MSNBC, frankly. Maybe not as extreme, but they are journalistic operations with a slant. They're not killing people. ISIS is killing people and filming what they're doing. So I think there's a distinction to be drawn there.
I wanted to get your take on the future of investigative journalism, and I don't know if you agree with this in listening to your talk and thinking about war correspondents. I think of them as investigative journalists in a sense, and I think about people like David Halberstam and his role during the Vietnam War. What do you see as the future, knowing what's happened to many of our, the budget for investigative journalism? What do you see as the future for not just war correspondents, but also investigative journalism?
I guess if I had a complete answer to that, I would be taking Rupert Murdoch's place. Or I think the entire future of the media is still in flux. I don't think it's going to disappear. I think there will be a constant need for information. But I think that the way that will be delivered is yet to be decided. My personal guess is that we will see a rapid series of consolidation along the lines of, and I don't know what it would be, but Microsoft buys ABC News, buys the New York Times, and Google buys NBC, buys whatever, the Washington Post. Well, I guess Amazon has already bought the Washington Post. But I think that what you will end up getting is a new consolidation of media outlets, which will be cross-platform. So there will be video and text and streaming and so on and so forth. And then, the J schools are still churning out journalism graduates by the new time, more than ever. So there won't be any shortage of people who can do it. The question is how they'll get paid. I think that there is a danger of losing a generation of talent, a generation of experience of people who've been overseas. Because today, when I started in the mid-'80s in Central America, you would meet correspondents in Nicaragua from, the Philadelphia Inquirer and San Francisco Chronicle and the Chicago Tribune. If you go to Kabul today, there will be the New York Times, CNN, BBC, and the two wires, AP and Reuters, and that's probably about it. So a much smaller number of people, and so there's a danger that combined experience of that whole corpus of foreign correspondents will get thrown out as people downsize and hire, cheap interns. But I think it'll right itself, because I don't think that human beings like to be ignorant. We need to know what's going on, if only to know what's coming down the tunnel, coming out the tunnel against us. But the models are still very much in flux, and I don't know what that looks like. Who has the microphone? If you can stand up, it helps me, because I don't know where to look. There you go. Thank you.
I thought it would be nice if we had a moment of hope at the end of the speech. I was thinking,
Go ahead.
I had the opportunity to interview Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma a few years back and ask her about the future of education in Burma because there's almost none. And the very pitiful answer from her was, help us. We have no pencils, we have no crayons, we have no paper. So the question I really want to put to you is, what is the role and how effective can we be as America helping in these areas, not just fighting in those areas?
Well, that's a really nice thing to ask, really, because there are things the United States can do, and I'm a big fan of Asia. In fact, my World Affairs Council will be doing a conference on the future of Asia in September of this year. I find it so much more uplifting to operate in Asia, where people look to the future. Essentially, despite the cultural differences, want to have a similar type of life trajectory to us. They educate their kids, they want to get ahead, they want a better life for their kids, and to your point, they want to invest in education. Unfortunately, in the Middle East, it's not that way. They don't really look to the future. They don't educate their kids. They certainly don't educate their girls, which is horrendous. And they don't really want to have a similar life to us, which is okay. They want a different life, but it's clearly not okay for a lot of their own people, which is why they're generating all this discontent, and which is morphing into terrorism at some points. But in Asia, at least, they have a fundamental respect for education across Asia. There isn't a single country in Asia which isn't trying to work on its education system. In China, famously, has now got some of the best schools in the world in Shanghai. The Singaporean education system is legendary. There's some criticism about rote learning, but nonetheless, immense investment in education. And this is something I think the United States can really help, because, as you say, in Burma, they're a relatively poor country. They need not just pencils, but help with computers and so on and so forth. A lot of people in Burma speak English, so it's pretty easy insertion for the United States. We don't even have to learn the local language often. I think broadly, getting rid of USAID, getting rid of the U.S. Information Agency, USIA, was a mistake. We got tremendous bang for our buck in the Cold War by sending out, jazz bands. The Russians will see a jazz band. Wow, that's kind of good. Why don't we have that here? That type of diplomacy, soft diplomacy, has sort of gone by the board as we've sent out, the aircraft carriers and the special forces. People like America. Even in the Middle East, people love America. They're all trying to get here. They want to get visas. And they like us for our technology and our culture and our openness and all these good things. And I think that to me, and to your earlier question about how you confront ISIS, I don't think you can go at it in the ring with ISIS blow for blow and say, well, you cut his head off, so we're going to bomb you, and you go back and forth. I don't think you win that. But I think you do win the battle against ISIS by showing America as an open society, not a Donald Trump exclusionary society, but an open society where anyone who wants to come and work hard and get themselves educated can succeed. We can do that in country. The more that U.S. embassies do to engage with local people in these cultural programs, I think it's fantastic. People love our movies. Most countries don't have Hollywood. We have this extraordinary weapon to sell people our lifestyles, which is Hollywood, and we don't even have to do very much. Netflix has already done it, in fact. Every country in the world can now see Netflix except China, and that's because we can't work out how to make the Chinese pay for it, because they're just cheap. But nonetheless, this is an enormous weapon that we have. We just don't think of it as part of our toolbox, because we've been reduced to this very simple, you're either with us or against us dyad, which is either you're in NATO or we're going to bomb you. Probably not very helpful way of looking at the world. So yeah, bring on the pencils, bring on the movies, bring on the cultural engagement. Have more and more students come here. I think it's great. I know that the UC system is straining at the bonds with foreign students, but bring more, find other places to put them. It's great to bring them here to show them America, because they will be our friends, and they're not going to put car bombs outside our embassies when they go home.
Yeah, go ahead.
Who's next? Sir.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great large-scale answer. I'm almost ashamed of the small-scale answer I'm going to ask you. But you were embedded with the Marines, and you've flown on their helicopters, I'm sure. Every year or two, we have 2 Marine helicopters go banging into each other and killing 25 men. And we just had that last week, buried in the back pages off Hawaii. What's going on? Why can't these damned helicopters fly further apart? Sorry.
So it is true that in a country where the fields are sown with IEDs, you are very grateful when the helicopters come in and lift you up above that and get you to point B and then put you down. But outside of combat, I would never fly in a helicopter. They are the most dangerous method of transportation I've ever been in. They break down all the time. The Marine helicopters, I don't know how many people here have been in a Marine helicopter, but they have this bizarre hydraulic system that always leaks, which means that your clothes and your gear emerges from that helicopter covered in oil. And the first time it happens, you say, there's something wrong with this helicopter. And the Marine will kind of look and yeah. And then after you've done it 5 or 10 times, you realize they're all like that. These are not safe methods of conveyance. You know, the Jesus nut thing, you know, the nut, if the nut goes, everything else goes. Yeah, Harrison Ford was able to land his plane without an engine on Penmar Golf Course, quite close to where I live. He walked out alive because planes keep gliding. Once, you know, helicopters, once they lose power, that's it, you're dead. So those tours around New York City or Grand Canyon, on a risk analysis basis, I'm not going there.
Your turn, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Who's next? Yes, ma'am.
A question. I have a question. Is it on? I have a question about the military.
Yes.
These are nations at war. Afghanistan, okay, Iraq. Are those militaries and the police volunteers? Do they have a draft system? Where are all the men that live in these nations? And is there any effort to make an army out of them? I know we train the commanders here, okay? But who is in the military in all of these nations?
Far fewer than the high command claims, because they bank half their salaries. In other words, they'll say they've got 100,000, there's only 50,000, and they're keeping half the salaries for themselves. So in Iraq, the military has changed from used to be dominated by Sunnis, it's now largely Shiite. They're not drafted, they get paid. It's a country that doesn't have a lot of employment opportunity, so you know, you get a salary. They get huge rates of desertion, that's part of their problems. They're very badly led. We saw in Mosul, which is the second biggest city in Iraq, the entire Iraqi army ran away from something like 400 guys who were, you know, ISIS came in and they were shooting and these guys got scared. The first ones to leave, by the way, from Mosul were the generals, which is not a good sign. The same thing happened in Anbar. So the soldiers are not highly motivated. Their officers are mostly given their jobs out of nepotistic considerations rather than out of their qualifications, and they are very unsure of themselves in fighting against ISIS because they're all Shiite and they know that if they get caught, there is no prisoner of war exchange, they're going to be killed. In Afghanistan, the military is largely run by the Tajiks, which are the Northern Alliance from the north. The Taliban are Pashtun, which is the other big ethnic group in Afghanistan. The problem they have there is they don't even speak the same language. So in Iraq, Sunnis and Shiites, they all speak Arabic. In Afghanistan, the Tajiks speak Dari, which is a form of Persian, Iranian. The Pashtuns speak Pashto, which is a completely different language and mutually unintelligible. They don't even come from the same linguistic group. And so what we would see often in Afghanistan, you would have a new batch of Afghan military come into Helmand province, and the Marines, particularly the Marines who just arrived, would say, okay, we need to go out and talk to the people, and they assemble these Afghan recruits and they bring them out to the fields and they say, right, what do they say? And the Afghans would look and say, well, we don't know, we don't speak their language. And of course, that hadn't really percolated through our chain of command, and we didn't realize that, you know, Afghan troops aren't all the same from the same cookie cutter. So that's a big challenge in Afghanistan, and it's actually the Tajiks have jealously maintained control over the military because they are afraid of if you like, Pashtun Taliban infiltration. So they know if you're a Tajik, you're probably not Taliban, so they can trust you. And so for that reason, even though I think the Taliban will take over large swaths of southern Afghanistan, which is their stronghold, I don't see a repeat of the takeover of Kabul as the Taliban did last time, 2006. There is no, 1996, there is no capitulation in Kabul scenario because it's basically run by Tajiks. But that doesn't mean that, the bigger picture is pretty dismal because it's such a split military and society. Sir.
With the multitude of languages and dialects that these areas that you visited and worked in have, how do you communicate with, let's say, the average person in some of these remote areas and really get to know what they think, and how do you communicate with them?
That's a great question. And the great untold story of every single foreign correspondent is the fixer, the Dith Prans of this world. I have a list of fixers from every country I've worked in who not only help as interpreters, but also, in some ways, more importantly, as cultural interpreters who'll tell me, Mr. Terry, don't point your foot at that man because he will kill you. You don't point your foot at people in the Arabic world, for example. Or Mr. Terry, you need to eat more food because if you don't, you'll offend this person and he won't tell you. The amount of times I've been saved from making a fool of myself or saying something stupid or just missing a story through the artifice of my fixers, I can't even start to count. We, of course, pay pretty well as Western correspondents, and so it's a pretty popular job. It's not hard to get fixers. In fact, sometimes you have to discriminate and be discriminating in whom you hire because you need to get somebody who's good. But that, to me, without local staff, we are nothing. In Iraq, a lot of the footage that we used when I was there for ABC News was shot by Iraqi crew. In fact, we lost a camera crew, Allah and Saif, on a very grim day in Baghdad. Our cameraman, Allah, was stopped in the car on the way home. He was a Sunni, and the sound man was he was Shiite. The sound man was a Christian. And he was stopped at a roadblock on his way home one day from work, and it was a Shiite. He was Shiite, so it was a Sunni roadblock, and they were after him. And they said, "We know who you are," and they also knew who the sound man was, the Christian guy. Said, "You can go home. We don't have any argument with you. We just want you, Allah, the cameraman." And the Christian guy, safe to his credit, he said, "No, he's my friend. I'm staying with him." So they ended up shooting them both, and our contacts found them in the hospital morgue the next day. But without these local hires, as we call them, we are blind and deaf and dumb and stupid, and they don't get nearly the amount of credit that they should get. So I thank you for that question.
Is there any access to North Korea? Are correspondents able to get in and get any information at all about what's going on in the country?
So that's actually a multi-layered question. Yes, there is access to North Korea. In fact, my council took a group to North Korea just last year, or earlier this year, in fact, I guess, or 2016, 2015. Some correspondents can get in. CNN has a particular relationship there that they can get in and out. But the third part of your question, can they find out what's going on? It seems not. North Korea is a very difficult society to penetrate. Most North Koreans know that it's very dangerous for them to talk to a foreigner, and there are so few foreigners there anyway, it's extremely easy to monitor. The security know where all the foreigners are at any given time, and so if a civilian comes up and talks to you, they can get in trouble. The political system is completely opaque. We have no idea what this guy Kim Jong-un is doing. When he set off his H-bomb or his wannabe H-bomb or whatever it was a couple of weeks ago, even the Chinese didn't know that was coming, and they are the closest friends, if you can call them, that the North Koreans have. So for journalists, you go into North Korea, you get shown their Potemkin village type, you know, the school, the kids, the ballet school, the circus acrobats. They've stopped taking you on tours of factories because they don't have any factories that work anymore. They don't have any power and they don't have any raw ingredients. But you can see a little bit, but you really have no idea what's going on. And indeed, a lot of North Koreans don't really know what's going on in the other parts of their country. They can't really move around. Pyongyang is this sort of sanctified place where you only get to live if you're, have a good job with the government, and if you're not old and you're not sick or infirm. Everyone else is swept out of that city. So a lot of people don't know what's going on in their own country. For foreign correspondents, it's almost impossible to work out really what's going on there.
Everybody, I think, can you hear me? I think we're done. There's going to be one more question, and I'm going to ask it because that's my privilege. My question is based on something you said about there is a need for moderate Muslims in the Middle East to start taking control of their region and saying, we don't want to live like this anymore. Do you have any sense of, it seems pretty difficult for the average person, anybody, to stand up and take that courageous a stand. Do you have any idea of what group might do this, or is there a particular country where the leadership would be more inclined to be that voice of reason, or do you think we're not there yet?
Well, I want to end this session on an up note. So
sorry about that.
Let me give a shout out here to the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Quietly, they're doing quite a lot. I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of meeting Abdullah Al-Sabusi, who's their Consul General here. He's a wonderful man, very cultured and very sympathetic guy to talk to. And you know, they're not all stupid. They understand the predicament that the Middle East is in. The Saudis have begun sending a lot of students to the United States to try and upgrade their intellectual capital. And the Emiratis, who are essentially traders, need to understand the outside world. So the UAE has been fairly enlightened in trying to maneuver behind the scenes. When Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani girl, was shot in the face by yet another Taliban bigot who didn't think girls should be educated. And I, as a father of 3 girls, I have a particular repugnance for that type of ignorance. The ruler of UAE, his son actually, a prince, sent his personal jet right away to Peshawar and said, pick her up and take her to the West. And even the plane was en route before they even knew where they were going to take her, and the British volunteered. I think she ended up in a hospital in Birmingham, but they knew that she was in trouble. She needed good medical help. It was not going to be available in Pakistan, so he got her out pretty quickly. But the UAE has been very forward-thinking. So you've probably heard of this problem that the Gates Foundation and WHO have been having in their anti-polio vaccination campaign. Unfortunately, some other Stone Age idiots in the Taliban have said that the polio vaccination campaign is an attempt to neuter Muslims and stop them having babies, and so you shouldn't get vaccinated. Sheer ignorance, lack of understanding, but it is what it is. And so they started this campaign where they were shooting, it was mostly women, vaccinators. So they would go around the streets and they would find these vaccinators and they shoot them dead. I don't know if any of you have seen polio victims. It's a horrendous thing. You can't walk. And so the Taliban's idea of whatever their idea was, that they were Muslim puritanical idea that they were going to kill these people. So the Emiratis quite smartly said, okay, let's take the American face off this. And this was with the agreement of the Gates Foundation. They said, right, instead of being Gates Foundation money, we'll pay for the campaign in Pakistan. You can pay for, Africa and India and all these other countries, but we'll do Pakistan. We'll pick it up. Plus, how about we get the vaccine made in Indonesia instead of wherever it was made in Europe, which is also a Muslim country, far more sensible Muslim country than some of the ones in the Middle East. And then we can say it's a Muslim vaccine delivered by Muslims, paid for by Muslims, and then the Taliban can't object. And so they've had some success there. Now, there was a bombing outside a vaccination center just last week, but the vaccination rate has gone way up again, and it's been helped a lot by what I would say is the much more enlightened approach of much smarter Muslims who understand that, as the departing British ambassador from Lebanon recently said in a very nice letter, this is not about Sunni or Shia or Christian or Muslim. This is about whether you believe in coexistence or whether you don't. And that's really what it comes down to. And I think that there are voices in the Muslim world who do believe in coexistence, and it's up to us to reach out to them and not to say, you can't come to our country. It's to reach out to the ones that we can work with, because we need them to solve this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.